All right, here we're going to talk about our discussion on Gilded Age immigration. We're going to focus specifically on why this huge wave of immigration happened when it did, who predominantly did the immigrating, uh, what their experience was like in the travel, because that's important to the story, and then what happened once they got into the United States. So we're talking about the Gilded Age, 1870 to about 1910. Here we see a huge wave of people coming into the United States, and we see a shift of people moving even within the United States. We see a huge trend towards urbanization in the United States, people becoming more focused on living in cities as opposed to rural areas. In 1880, 20% of Americans lived in cities, and that's about the beginning of the Gilded Age, maybe a little into the Gilded Age at that point. By the time we get to 1900, just 20 years later, that's almost doubled. Nearly 40% of people living in the United States are in cities, and by the time we get to the 1920s, two-thirds of Americans living in cities. That's a huge shift in a fairly short amount of time. Later in the unit, we'll talk about the development of cities, and you see why cities need to develop because of the huge population increase they saw in a short amount of time. So two sources for this shift in towards urbanization. One, a lot of people coming from foreign countries, and when they did that, they tended to stay in cities, especially with the new immigrants we're going to talk about. Early immigrants tended to want to go into the maybe Midwest and try and get land for themselves, but increasingly more and more people stayed in cities. And rural life was tough. Farming was tough, as we'll talk about. So a lot of people were abandoning their farms or moving out of rural areas and into cities, and that's going to contribute to that population increase as well. So why did this huge shift in immigration happen when it did? Well, it was more technologically possible. People could cross the ocean for a long time, a couple hundred years at this point, but it was a long journey. It was really expensive. Now with steam powered ships, it was quicker, it was safer, and it was cheaper, and more people could take advantage of that. So when we talk about why people made this journey to live in a different country, specifically in the United States, we can talk about two factors that help us explain their motivations. One is push factors. People wanted to leave where they were, and that could be for any number of reasons. We'll talk about some examples in a second. The other is once they've made the decision to leave their homes, they then decided to come to the United States. So in this case, what is it about the United States that drew so many millions of people into the United States? So we're going to talk about some examples of both. So let's just start off by saying there's potentially as many push and pull factors as there are immigrants themselves. We're just going to focus on some common ones. When we're talking about European immigration, people come from European countries. Baby booms sounds great. I mean, babies are fun, but when we're talking about a huge population increase in a small amount of space, that can lead to scarcity of goods and maybe some hard times in those countries, especially for people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. So they may want to look to other opportunities. Improved technology, again, sounds great, but if we're talking about mechanization, then it's potentially people losing jobs and people's work being able to be done by machines rather than by hand. And so, again, people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder are losing their work. There's also religious persecution. This is a push factor for people going back to the pilgrims. Particularly Russian Jews is just one example, were heavily persecuted by the Russian government. Their villages were attacked, people were killed, and if that's your reality, then you're going to go to a country, especially one espousing religious freedom. So in terms of pull factors, what is it about the United States that drew so many people here? It's just possibility. It's the prospect of better pay, prospect of better conditions, building a life for your family, and maybe not even necessarily for themselves, but future generations. And if you're of European heritage, then that was potentially in your family's past at some point. There was also, because of the size of the United States, the possibility of getting land, especially through the Homestead Act, and we know that that land was ostensibly could have been free. Um, and coming from smaller European countries in which getting land was not a possibility, this was huge. So we know that land wasn't always super awesome, and those farms didn't always succeed, but there was that prospect there. So again, those are just a couple common ones, but there are, of course, many other push and pull factors. So when we talk about who made that journey, we can break those. We can separate those people into two different eras. And the Divine Line is about 1880. So we can talk about old immigrants 1880 and before, and new immigrants 1880 and after. What were the old immigrants like? Typically, they came from northwestern Europe. So we're talking about Germany and Scandinavian countries, Central Europe, Austria, those kinds of areas, as well as Ireland was a big source of immigration to the United States. A lot of these people were culturally similar to the existing Americans that were already in the United States. That helped them assimilate easier and more easily into American life, and therefore there were fewer conflicts with those immigrants from those areas. So when we say culturally similar, what do we mean? We mean they're white, Protestant Christian, which at the time was pretty important, and they were more likely to be illiterate. Not everyone was literate in their own language, but they were more likely to be compared to the group that we're going to talk about here in a second. So again, easier to assimilate into American culture. Couldn't necessarily tell who was an immigrant, who was an existing American. The one group from this era that was culturally dissimilar and discriminated against was the Irish, and they experienced things that we're going to talk about next with the new immigrants. So about 1880, when the steamships started to be able to transport people faster and cheaper, we see more and more different kinds of people come to the United States. So where do these people come from? Southeast Europe, so Southern and Eastern Europe, I should say. Italy, Greece, Russia, Poland, what's now Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, areas like that, as well as Asian countries, especially China. So what is it about these people? Obviously, they're culturally dissimilar, multicultural. So just visually, they kind of stood out. More likely to be Catholic, Jewish, and Orthodox, which is different from Protestant Christian. And so you add that to the fact that they were more likely to be poor, more likely to be illiterate. There were more opportunities for them to stand out, to be seen as different, and that differentness led to some people discriminating against them. So that made it harder to assimilate in American culture, even though many obviously eventually did. So we see a shift there, and that's something that we'll continue to talk about throughout the class. It's in terms of the voyage itself, a week or two, maybe more, depending on the weather to cross the Atlantic. It was not a cruise. It was not a fun trip. It was to be endured, not enjoyed. Most people, because of their financial restrictions, were forced to travel in a section of the ship called steerage, which is below deck, poor ventilation, not a lot of light, not much food provided. Restroom facilities. It was a really bad trip, and these people were crammed onto the ship. And why were they crammed on the ship? Because the more people that were on the ship, the more money the company made. So then you get situations like this. Now that wouldn't have been looking like that for 2 weeks solid, but there were obviously a lot of people on the ship. Once you get to the United States, for a time, you just go to the port city of Boston or Baltimore or New York or wherever, and you just kind of go in. At a certain point, because of the numbers, the country decided we needed a central hub for all the European immigrants coming into the country. So they created Ellis Island in 1892. And at Ellis Island, people were organized, categorized, indexed, information was written down, they were checked for diseases to make sure that sicknesses weren't being spread into the population. The West Coast had its own station, Angel Island, which saw obviously mostly Asian immigrants. This station was particularly nasty, more like a prison than a welcoming station like Ellis Island. And the reason for that is just basically racism. So a few pictures real quick about Ellis Island. These people would sit in these lines until they were called forward. What's your name? Where do you come from? Where you plan on going? How much money do you have? Who's with you? All of that information. That's still available. You can, if you're of European ancestry, you can look on the Ellis Island website and see if there's anybody from your family that went through Ellis Island. The medical inspection was a big part. Smallpox, tuberculosis, diseases, highly contagious diseases like that, as well as a disease called trachoma, which was, again, pretty contagious. And to check for that, medical inspectors would check under people's eyelids. If you were found to be ill, you could be set aside on Ellis Island. There were places for people to convalesce and get well, and be quarantined, most importantly, and then led into the United States. Some people, if they were sick enough, were sent back, which obviously was very sad. Who are we talking about here? Mostly men aged 15 through 40. Didn't have a whole lot of skills. These new immigrants especially would take whatever jobs they could get. There were people that were referred to as birds of passage that came to the United States to make some money and then go back home to their home country. And a lot of Americans disliked this because that meant they were taking jobs and taking the money out of the economy instead of helping the money to circulate through the American economy. So yeah, that's another reason that some people criticized, especially these new immigrants. And that criticism led to a movement called nativism. And so nativists viewed these immigrants as a threat to the United States socially, economically, maybe even politically, and took out their frustration, their anger in a number of ways. The most famous of which is a law in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which focused obviously on Chinese immigrants and said that laborers couldn't come in. If they were already in and they left, they couldn't come back. But you didn't see any German Exclusion Act or even Italian Exclusion Act. It was just the Chinese there. There was also a law that Congress passed requiring immigrants to be able to read and write in their own language, not necessarily English. That bill was vetoed a number of times until Congress was able to override the veto in the early 1900s. So that was a law that was on the books for a while. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you're able to use this and fill out your notes in your binder. If you have any questions, of course, please let me know.